In the summer of 1862, a warship slipped down the River Mersey and out to sea. She had no name yet, only a number. Within 2 years she would hunt the United States Navy across 4 oceans, burn 65 American ships, and leave behind a bill so large that Britain would one day pay the United States $15.5 million to settle it. She was built in a town that 60 years earlier had been home to 110 people. This is the story of Birkenhead, a town that did not slowly grow the way most towns do, but was summoned into existence almost from nothing in a single human lifetime by the will of one family. A place that would give the world some of its most famous ideas and objects, and then watch them travel out across the oceans, while the town itself stayed exactly where it had always been, on the muddy west bank of the Mersey, in the long shadow of Liverpool. But before the shipyard, before the ships that changed the way navies fought and the way sailors died, before any of it, there was only the mud. Look at that riverbank as it was at the turn of the 19th century, and there is almost nothing to see. A scatter of farmhouses, a crumbling old priory, founded by Benedictine monks more than 600 years before, its stones already half forgotten. A ferry house where boatmen had rowed travellers across to Liverpool since the Middle Ages, and a population recorded in the census of 1801 of exactly 110 people. 17 families living in 16 houses. That was Birkenhead. A name that came from old words meaning the headland where the birch trees grew, a green tongue of land poking out into the tidal water, good for grazing sheep and very little else. Across the river, everything was different. Liverpool was already one of the great ports of the world, its docks thick with the masts of ships, its merchants growing rich on cotton and sugar and, for a long and shameful stretch, on the trade in enslaved human beings. Liverpool had money and noise and importance. Birkenhead had a ferry and a field, and for centuries that was the whole arrangement. One shore mattered and the other did not. What changed everything was steam. In the 1820s, a regular steam ferry began to cross the Mersey, and suddenly the quiet Wirral shore was no longer a world away from the bustle of Liverpool. It was minutes away, and where there is easy access to a booming port, there will always be a certain kind of man, watching, calculating, imagining what could be built on empty ground. One of those men was a Scot named William Laird. Laird had come down from Greenock near Glasgow and had settled in Liverpool in the year 1810 to run the family rope-making business. But rope was not the limit of his ambition. By the 1820s he had drifted into engineering and had helped set up a steamship company running between Liverpool and Glasgow. He had begun to look across the water at that undeveloped Birkenhead shore and to see, where others saw marsh and pasture, something that did not yet exist. In 1824, together with 2 business partners, he bought a large piece of that land. The original idea had been to cut a canal across the Wirral. That scheme fell through, so instead, Laird did something else. On an inlet of the river called Wallasey Pool, he established the Birkenhead Iron Works, and he began, at first, to make boilers. Boilers. It is an unglamorous word to stand at the beginning of an empire, but hold on to it, because that humble trade is about to become the hinge on which the whole story turns. Because William Laird did not think small. He owned the land, and in his mind he could already see the town that would rise on it, a place of real magnificence, nothing like the rough huddle of workers' cottages a lesser man would have thrown up. He wanted to build a new town on the model of the new town of Edinburgh, that cool grey masterpiece of Georgian planning, all wide straight avenues and elegant stone terraces. He commissioned a leading Edinburgh architect, James Gillespie Graham, to lay out a gridiron of handsome streets radiating from a great central square. That square would be called Hamilton Square, after the family of Laird's wife, and it was placed with real cunning on rising ground so that its grand facades would be visible from the Liverpool waterfront across the river. This was to be more than a town, it was to be a statement, aimed directly at the great port that had ignored this shore for 1,000 years. "Look," it said, "look what we are building over here." Work began on the eastern side of the new town, around Hamilton Square, in the middle of the 1820s. And for a moment, imagine William Laird standing there, in the mud, watching the first stone terraces rise, seeing in his mind a whole gleaming city of merchants and gardens and civic pride. He was going to will it into being. But the thing about willing a city into being is that you cannot control what kind of city you get, and the force that would make Birkenhead rich and swell it far beyond anything Laird first imagined was about to rise from that unglamorous little boiler works down by the water. The turn came through his son. John Laird had trained as a solicitor's clerk, a young man bound for a quiet life of contracts and deeds. But in 1828 he joined his father in the business, and John had an idea that most sensible men of the age thought was close to madness. He looked at the way his workers bent sheets of iron and riveted them together to make boilers, and he realized that the very same skills could be used to build the hull of a ship made of iron, in a world where every other vessel afloat was built of wood. You have to understand how strange that sounded. For all of human history, ships had been made of wood because wood floats and iron sinks. Every sailor knew it in his bones. The idea of a vessel built from heavy metal plates seemed to defy the most basic law of the sea. And yet in 1829, the Lairds launched their first ship. It was a small thing, a prefabricated iron lighter around 60 feet long, built for a canal company in Ireland, and sent over the water in pieces to be assembled. It floated, of course it floated, and with that unremarkable little barge, a revolution began on the banks of the Mersey. The Lairds pressed forward while the wooden world was still shaking its head. In the small iron steamer Gary Owen, launched in the 1830s, they used watertight bulkheads, dividing the hull into sealed compartments so that a leak in one section would not sink the whole vessel. It was the kind of idea that would still be saving lives a century later, and then the orders that would make their name began to arrive, and they were not gentle ones. In 1839, the Lairds built the Nemesis, an iron paddle steamer that became one of the first ocean-going iron warships in the world. She was sent east, and she proved brutally effective in the first Opium War against China. Her shallow iron hull carrying her up rivers where no wooden warship could follow. The East India Company came back for more. The yard built a whole flotilla of iron gunboats. A firm that had started by making boilers in a place that barely existed was now arming the expansion of an empire. And here is the quiet tragedy folded into the grand design. That elegant gridiron of streets that Gillespie Graham had drawn, that whole vision of a stone city to rival Edinburgh, was never finished. The economic slumps of the mid-century and the sheer pressure of all those labourers needing somewhere to live meant the grand plan was quietly abandoned. Hamilton Square, the great central set piece, ended up being the only part of the original dream fully built. It stands there still, a single perfect fragment of a city that was imagined and never completed. To this day it holds more Grade 1 listed buildings, the highest rank of protected historic architecture, than anywhere in Britain outside Trafalgar Square in London. A masterpiece and an orphan. The beginning of a sentence the town never got to finish. William Laird did not live to see most of what his gamble would become. He died in 1841, with the great square still rising and the shipyard still finding its feet. It fell to his son John and to the town's commissioners to carry the vision forward, and what they built next was, in its own way, the most extraordinary gift this improbable town would ever give the world. In 1850, a young American was walking through England, and a baker in Birkenhead urged him not to leave town without seeing the new park. So he went. His name was Frederick Law Olmsted, and at that moment he was nobody in particular. A farmer with a restless mind. What he saw in Birkenhead Park stopped him in his tracks. He wandered its winding paths, past its lakes and lawns, and he was overwhelmed by the beauty of it, and even more by what it meant. Here was a garden of real magnificence, and it did not belong to a duke or a king. It belonged to the public. He wrote that the poorest peasant here was as free to enjoy the whole of it as the Queen herself. He called it the People's Garden, and it lodged in his imagination and would not leave. 8 years later, Frederick Law Olmsted won a competition to design a great new public park in the heart of New York City, and into that design, into Central Park, the most famous urban park on the face of the earth, he poured the ideas that had struck him like lightning on the west bank of the Mersey. The rolling meadows, the sense of countryside within the city, the winding paths that reveal the landscape a little at a time. The radical notion that such beauty should belong to everyone. Central Park is many things, and it had many influences, but at its root lies a debt to a park in a town that most New Yorkers, walking those famous lawns, have never even heard of. The head of the Central Park Conservancy has called Birkenhead the father park to Manhattan's Green Heart. Think about that for a moment. One of the most beloved places in America is, in part, a copy of something built in the shadow of Liverpool, and that turns out to be the deepest pattern in Birkenhead's whole story. Because this town's most powerful exports were rarely things you could weigh or hold. They were ideas, they were names, they were reputations that floated free of the muddy riverbank and travelled out across the world, until the whole planet knew them and almost nobody remembered where they had begun. The park was only the gentlest of those exports. The next one was born not in a garden but in a catastrophe. Back in 1845, the Laird yard had built an iron warship for the Royal Navy. She had first been laid down under the name Vulcan, but she was renamed after the town that made her. She was called HMS Birkenhead. Designed as a frigate, she was converted instead into a troop ship, and in the early months of 1852, she set out for southern Africa carrying soldiers from 10 different regiments, along with a number of their wives and children, to a colonial war at the Cape. In the small hours of the 26th of February, 1852, off a stretch of the South African coast grimly named Danger Point, the Birkenhead struck an uncharted rock. The iron hull tore open, water poured into the compartments below, and it became clear very quickly that there were nowhere near enough usable lifeboats for the 643 people on board. In that moment, on the tilting deck of a ship named for a town most of them had never seen, the soldiers did something that would echo for generations. Their commanders ordered them to stand fast in their ranks so that the boats could be filled, first with the women and the children, and they obeyed. As the ship broke apart beneath them and the sea rose around their boots, the men stood still and held their formation. Only 193 of the 643 aboard survived. But every one of the women and children in the boats was saved. The discipline of those doomed men astonished the world. It gave rise to a phrase and a principle that we still invoke today whenever disaster strikes at sea. Women and children first. The Birkenhead drill, as it came to be called, was immortalised decades later in a poem by Rudyard Kipling. The King of Prussia was so moved that he ordered an account of it read aloud to every regiment in his army, and so the name of a small Wirral town, a name coined by a shipbuilder in honour of his wife's family, became forever attached to a fixed idea of human courage. Another export, another famous thing carried far away from the riverbank that produced it. Which brings us back to that nameless warship we began with, slipping down the Mersey in the summer of 1862. By then, the Laird shipyard, now run by John Laird's sons and known for a time as John Laird's Sons and Company, was one of the most respected builders of iron ships anywhere on earth. The yard was so famous that the novelist Jules Verne, who visited the area, would nod to it in 20,000 Leagues Under the Seas, having some of the iron of his fictional submarine come from the Laird works. And into that yard, in the middle of the American Civil War, came a secret commission. The Confederate States of the American South needed warships, and they could not build enough at home, so their agents came quietly to Britain and to Birkenhead and arranged for the construction of a fast, powerful commerce raider built under the innocent guise of an ordinary merchant vessel to slip through the loopholes of British neutrality law. During construction, she was known only by her yard number, hull number 290. She was launched under the false name Enrica, and in the summer of 1862 she slipped away from the Mersey, sailed to the Azores, and was there fitted with her guns and commissioned into the Confederate Navy under a new name, CSS Alabama. Under her captain, Raphael Semmes, the Alabama became the terror of the seas. Over almost 2 years she ranged across the Atlantic into the Caribbean, around the Cape of Good Hope, and out into the Indian Ocean, and she never once put in at a southern port. She simply roamed, hunting the merchant ships of the United States. She captured or burned around 65 American vessels. She drove up marine insurance rates so sharply that ship owners began registering their ships under foreign flags to escape her, doing lasting damage to the American merchant fleet, and she outran or outwitted every Union warship sent to catch her, until finally, in June of 1864, off Cherbourg in France, she was cornered by the USS Kearsarge and sent to the bottom in a battle lasting little more than an hour. But the Alabama story did not end when she sank. It ended in a courtroom, and it changed the world. The United States was furious that Britain, officially neutral, had allowed such a ship to be built in a British yard and turned loose against American commerce. After the war, the dispute festered, and it came to be known as the Alabama Claims. In 1872, the matter was placed before an international tribunal in Geneva, one of the first great acts of binding international arbitration between nations. The tribunal found against Britain. It ordered the British government to pay the United States $15.5 million in damages for the destruction caused by the Alabama and the other British-built raiders. The case became a landmark in the history of international law, a precedent that would echo down toward the League of Nations and beyond. A warship built by a shipyard in a former hamlet of 110 people had, in the end, helped to reshape the legal relations between nations. You begin to see the strange grandeur of it. Central Park, women and children first, a foundation stone of international arbitration, all of it in some sense made in Birkenhead, and still the firsts kept coming. The man at the centre of so much of it, John Laird, had by now become far more than a shipbuilder. He was the driving force of the whole town, chairman of its improvement commissioners, and when Birkenhead was finally granted its own Member of Parliament in 1861, it was John Laird who was elected as the town's first ever representative in the House of Commons. And it was in that same period, with Laird presiding over the town's affairs, that Birkenhead added yet another world first to its collection, thanks to one of the most flamboyant characters ever to pass through it. His name, almost too perfectly, was George Francis Train, an American entrepreneur who had made money in shipping and who ran a Liverpool office. Train was a showman and a visionary who had watched horse-drawn street railways transform American cities and who dreamed of bringing them to Britain. He tried to interest the great cities and met resistance, but in Birkenhead, with John Laird's backing, he found his opening. He laid his track at his own expense, and in a matter of weeks it was ready. On the 30th of August 1860, the first street tramway in Europe opened for business in Birkenhead, its horse-drawn cars running from the Woodside Ferry through the town to the gates of Birkenhead Park. Train, being Train, threw a lavish banquet to celebrate and sent invitations to the crowned heads of Europe, including the Queen and the Pope. None of them came. But on that first day, some 5,000 ordinary passengers climbed aboard, gliding smoothly along the iron rails at 7 miles an hour, riding the first street tramway on the continent. It was a template that cities across Europe would soon copy, one more idea, born on the Wirral, sent out to the world. William Laird, the rope maker who had gambled everything on an empty riverbank, never saw the full flowering of what he started. But his son John lived to see the town become a genuine power before he died in 1874 after a riding accident in his house at number 63 Hamilton Square, on the very square his father had built. The town grieved him as a founder. An appeal for a statue drew donations from nearly 2,400 people, and when it was unveiled, a crowd of many thousands filled the square to honour the solicitor's clerk who had bet his life on the mad idea that iron could float. And Birkenhead was not finished with its firsts, even then. In 1886, the town was linked to Liverpool by the Mersey railway, running through a tunnel bored beneath the bed of the river itself, the first railway tunnel in the world to be driven under a tidal estuary. In 1903, the Laird firm merged with the Sheffield steelmakers Charles Camel and Company and became Camel Laird, a name that would ring through the 20th century. From that yard came warships and liners and record-breaking vessels by the hundred, and when the aircraft carrier Ark Royal was launched from Birkenhead in the 1930s, some 30,000 people gathered along the Mersey to watch her go down into the water. The muddy riverbank had become, without exaggeration, one of the most famous shipyards on the face of the earth. So walk through Birkenhead today, and you are walking through the ghost of an astonishing act of will. Stand in Hamilton Square, and you are standing inside the one finished chapter of a book that was never completed, surrounded by those grand Georgian facades, more of them protected as national treasures than anywhere in Britain, but one square in London, with the statue of John Laird still keeping watch, and his old house at number 63 still standing on the corner. Walk out to Birkenhead Park, and the lakes and the winding paths and the rustic bridges are still there, still free, still the people's own, so quietly important that they now sit on the waiting list to become a World Heritage Site, honoured as the ancestor of Central Park an ocean away. Down at the river, part of George Francis Train's original tramway route still carries heritage trams for those who come to remember. And along the same waterfront where it all began, the Camel Laird yard is still building ships. Most recently, the great polar research vessel that carries the name of Sir David Attenborough. And yet, for all of it, the old pattern holds. Ask almost anyone, even in Britain, about Birkenhead, and you will get a vague answer, if you get one at all. It remains, as it has always been, the quieter shore, the place across the water from the city everyone has heard of, a town whose gifts became world famous while the town itself did not, which is, in the end, the truth this place has to teach. Birkenhead was willed out of the mud in a single lifetime, and it spent its genius almost recklessly, scattering its inventions and its ideals and even its own name across the globe. The most famous park in America carries its fingerprints. The phrase we reach for in every shipwreck was forged in its harbour. A cornerstone of international law was laid because of a vessel that slid down its slipway one summer evening. The world kept the treasures, Birkenhead kept the Riverbank, and perhaps that was always the bargain of the place, from the moment William Laird looked across the water and decided to build a city where there was only birch trees and grazing land. You can summon a whole world into being on an empty shore. You just cannot promise that the world will remember where it came from. The mud is still there, the river still runs, and somewhere in the tide off Cherbourg, and in the lawns of Manhattan, and in the last words of drowning men who stood still so that others could live, a small town on the Wirral is remembered without ever being named. If you enjoyed this journey through the improbable rise of Birkenhead, do consider subscribing, because there are many more forgotten places and buried histories still to uncover. And if you like this video, YouTube also thinks you are going to like this one on your screen right now. Go ahead and give it a watch.